Welcome to chapter 21 of the book of Genesis, the birth of Isaac, the son of Abraham. I'll read some in the Greek and then we'll go through the chapter. Ke Kyrios episkepsato tin saran, katha ipe, ke epis se Kyrios ti Sara katha elalise. And the Lord visited Sarah as he said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he spoke. The visited, I believe, here is a figure of speech, for he did, right here, he did to Sarah as he spoke. Visited is sort of like, this is what happened. Now, he was there, and it could be relating to when the Lord was with the three men. They came, and Sarah was hiding behind the curtain, but that is a possibility. But and the Lord did to Sarah as he spoke, that is, allowing her to have a child. And conceiving, she bore to Abraham a son in old age, in the time as the Lord spoke to him, to Abraham. Now we can compare this, I believe, to Elizabeth in the New Testament. Very similar. It says in Luke 1:6, and there was not a child to them insofar as Elizabeth was sterile, and both were advancing in their days. And Elizabeth and Zacharias, her husband, were the parents of John the Immerser, John the Baptist, if you will. And the Lord appeared to Zacharias in the temple and told him that Sarah would have a son, and he doubted, and he couldn't speak for a while until the baby was being christened. And so this is very similar to what is happening here. Now, whether there's a spiritual tie to the two, probably there is, that God can do things beyond what humans can expect or can think about. I'm not a woman, never been a woman, don't consider myself a woman, and I have no feelings or understanding of how a woman could possibly feel if she has something inside of her that wants to have a child, and she can't. I would imagine that would tear you apart for many years, wanting to have a child. There's probably something that's inside of a woman's DNA, and I'm just imagining it not being a woman, that has certain feelings and desires or things that she wants to have. And if she can't, it's very difficult on that person to be sterile and not to have a child. And this is something they both had in common with Sarah and Elizabeth. They were both sterile, but God took over and allowed each one to have a child. Now, today, if you're sterile and you really want to have a child and you look at these stories and say, why hasn't that happened to me? I don't have the answer. God has the answer. And I would, the only thing I could say would be to pray and have him show to you your purpose in life. For some reason, a child isn't in it, or possibly a miracle could happen and you could have a child. Now, my mother had me when she's 44 years old. She had my half-sister and half-brother when she was like 18. And so God can work in ways that we don't expect. It continues in verse 3, and Abraham called the name of his son born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised Isaac on the 8th day as Jesus was circumcised. Now, this is very interesting because the circumcision, as we mentioned before, predates the Mosaic laws. Moses is not going to be around to 400 years later than this time. But yet, circumcision is something that God mentioned or told Abraham to do, and he did it with his whole household, as we see in previous chapters. Now, God wasn't establishing a law, as I see. This was something between Abraham and his seed and God, and it was called a covenant. It wasn't some type of a law, but I believe that we as Christians are under the covenant of Abraham, not the covenant of Moses. So the circumcision, as I mentioned, I believe is valid for Christians being under the covenant of Abraham, not because of the Jews. If it was because of the Jews and you're not a Jew, then I would say, why do it? But continuing in 5, it says, and Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac, his son, was born. So they were both very old, and to be that old, I'm 80, in my 82nd year, but if I was 100 years old, and I believe that 100 years old then would be like today, having intimate relations with your wife would be unusual, and because you're probably so many years, a male is able to have seed, sperm, but the woman is the one that's not capable of producing a child after a certain age. But then this does happen in nature as long as it does here with God's intervention. So he went and had relations with his wife, and she did have a child. I believe that's an important thing to remember, because other places we'll talk about a little bit more of what did Abraham do that was of belief. He did believe in God, but how did he prove it? Well, we'll get into that a little bit later. And then in verse 6, it continues, and Sarah said, the Lord caused laughter to me, which she did behind the curtain earlier when the 3 men came and visited Abraham. And for whoever may hear will rejoice along with me. And she said, who will announce to Abraham that Sarah nurses a male child, for I bore a son in my old age? And the child grew and was weaned, and weaning is taking the child, when the child is taken away from the breast of the mother and now has to eat solid food other than the mother's milk. And Abraham made a great banquet the day Isaac, his son, was weaned. I guess that was a big thing, that the child would be taken away from the mother and sort of on his own for the first time as far as eating. And they made a great banquet for being weaned. Now, I don't know today, nobody seems to think about being weaned because there's so many children that are on the bottle formula that it's not a big deal. But there are those times when the child can stay on the mother's breast for a long time. And I had my father-in-law mention how when he was growing up, there was like an 8 or 9-year-old boy who was still on the mother's breast, and they called him Tit Wilson. And that does happen. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. I'm not the judge, but that can happen. So being weaned and away from the mother was something that people made a big thing out of it, though, at that time. It's sort of something, like I said, kind of lost because of the formula in the bottle, but it's interesting. And then in verse 9 it continues, and Sarah, beholding the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, who was born to Abraham, that would have been Ishmael, playing with Isaac, her son, and now Ishmael was 8 or 9 years older than Isaac. And she said to Abraham, you cast out this maidservant and her son, for not shall the son of the maidservant be heir with my son Isaac. Now, in Galatians 4:30, this is a quote, because you can see it's in these brackets. In Galatians 4:20, well, we'll start at 4:21. Paul says, "Tell me, O ones wanting to be under the law." Now, I don't want to be under the law of Moses, but some people do, and churches push this, and I'm not sure why, but here I think he's more talking to the Jews. Do you not hearken to the law? For it has been written that Abraham had two sons, one from out of the maidservant, and one from out of the free woman, Sarah, and Hagar, the maidservant. But the one indeed from out of Hagar, the maidservant, has been born according to flesh. But the one from out of the free woman, Sarah, was through the promise from God that the seed would come through her, which things are allegorized. For these are the two covenants, one indeed from Mount Sinai, in slavery, which is Hagar's slavery. That's a covenant that God made, he's saying, with Hagar and the people that are not Jews and are born of Abraham. For Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. So the Arabians more or less have become the Ishmaelites and so forth, and a powerful nation. It is corresponding with the present Jerusalem, and she, a slave with her children, Hagar. But the upward Jerusalem, so this is he's relating to the Ishmaelites still tied to Jerusalem as they are today. It's interesting, isn't it? But the upward Jerusalem, this is the new Jerusalem mentioned in the book of Revelation. It comes down out of heaven. It's a cube, which is mother of all of us. So the new Jerusalem, upward Jerusalem, is free. For it has been written, "Be glad, O sterile one, the one not giving birth. Break asunder and yell, O one not travailing, for many are the children of the barren rather than of the one having the husband." Now, we are more than to God, the ones that are going to the New Jerusalem, rather than the Mount of Jews. Now, we, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise, but as then the one born according to flesh, Ishmael from Hagar, persecuted the one born according to spirit. And so also now the Jews persecute the ones of the belief of Abraham, the Christians. But what says the scripture? Cast out the maidservant and her son, for not in any way shall the son of the maidservant inherit with the son of the free one. So then, brothers, we are not children of the maidservant, but of the free one. So it's kind of hard to follow this whole thing. I've been following it for years. I'm not sure I completely understand it, but we are sons of the free one, but both are the sons of Abraham. And it sort of almost seems like it reverses it. It makes the Jews become more of the children of the maidservant. Now, going back to our text, in verse 11, it says, "But the saying appeared hard, very hard before Abraham concerning his son Ishmael." And it was hard for Abraham because he loved Ishmael. It was his firstborn. But later, Ishmael and Abraham get together in chapter 25, verse 9, to bury their father Abraham. So they were in contact. And God said to Abraham, "Let it not be hard to you before you on account of the child, that would be Ishmael, and on account of the maidservant Hagar. All as much as Sarah should have said to you, you hearken to her voice, for a seed shall be called to you in Isaac. And now this is mentioned in Romans 9:7. It's a quotation. So let's go to Romans 9:7. It starts in 6. But it is not such as that the word of God has fallen, for not all the ones from out of Israel are these Israel, and not that all children are seed of Abraham, but in Isaac a seed shall be called to you. That is to say, not the children of the flesh are these children of God, but the children of the promise are imputed for seed. So the seed goes through Isaac and the promise goes through Isaac, and we are through Abraham and Isaac also, but not all of Isaac are believers, the Jews. For a promise is this word, the quotation of it, of what we're reading, according to this time I will come, and a son will be to Sarah, Isaac. Hebrews 11:18. And it starts in 17. It says, by belief, Abraham offered Isaac, being tested, and the one receiving the promises offered up the only child. This is later, we'll get into this in another chapter or so, towards whom it was said that in Isaac a seed shall be called to you, considering that God was able even to raise ones from out of dead ones, from where he received him even in parable. So that goes later. We'll find out about this, the sacrifice of Isaac. And it continues in 13, but also the son of this maidservant I will make into a great nation. That's Ishmael. And for he is your seed. So it's not confusing. I suppose you could use the word confusing. Intricate to understand how all these things that Paul is writing takes a little bit of study and knowing what's going on in the Old Testament. If you just started reading the New Testament and you're getting into the writings of Paul and you see this and you have never studied the Old Testament, you'd be lost. I would imagine you'd have to try to understand it. So me going through it, I think, should help, because 25 years I studied the Old and the New Testament, translated it, trying to show how this relates to the New Testament. And so here we got, and then Abraham. So Ishmael is going to be made into a great nation. And now what nation is that? Well, it says that Ishmael was there's going to be 12 nations from him, and it mentions that in the past few chapters. Today, the Muslims, which began as Arabs, believe that they are from Ishmael, which they are, and they are a seed of Abraham, which they are. Now, not the promise. The promise came through Isaac and the Jews, and then they rejected Jesus, who was the promise. Rejecting him now made the availability of the belief in Jesus to be taking the seed, which the Jews reject. And 14, Abraham rose up in the morning and took bread and a leather bag of water and gave to Hagar, and placed the male child upon her shoulders and sent her. And she went forth wandering about the wilderness by the well of the oath. The well of the oath is Beersheba, and we'll go to a map here, and we'll see where that is. It's down here. I have a board in front of it, but it's down here. You can see where it says Beersheba. Paran is where Ishmael went to live. And she went forth wandering about the wilderness, but the water ceased from coming out of the leather bag, and she tossed the male child underneath one fir tree. Now, well, the oath wasn't named until after this happened. And going forth, she sat down before him from far off as a bow shot, arrow, bow and arrow. For she said, no way shall I see the death of my child, terrible straits. And she sat before him, and yelling out, the child wept. It must be horrible to imagine in the desert, dry, hot, and the child is going to die. But God listened to the voice of the child from out of the place of which he was. And an angel of God called Hagar from out of the heaven, and said to her, well, what is it, Hagar? Fear not. And this is in Luke 1:30. The angel came to Mary and said, fear not, Mary, for you found favor with God. And the angel says, fear not, for God has heeded the voice of your child from out of the place of which he is. Rise up and take the child, Ishmael, and hold it in your hand. I will make it into a great nation. A great nation. Now, the Arabs are a great nation, and the Muslim religion is a great religion. I mean, it covers a vast area of the earth. Now, they're not of the seed, they're not of the promise, and so it is what it is. God has allowed the Muslims to be in existence for quite a while, not as long as Christians, and by no way as long as with the Jews. But that seed was always being went down until through the Arab nation. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? And so, to get into the point of wanting to go to battle and hate Jews, or getting to go to battle and hate the Muslims, I think that's God's business, that what he is doing, and it doesn't need my actions and hatred. God came, the Samaritans in the New Testament were people that were brought in by Sennacherib and into the area of Israel and became semi-Jewish. And Jesus sent the disciples to go through Samaria towards Jerusalem. And when he got there, the Samaritans didn't want to help them at all. And so I think it was James and John said, do you want us to call down fire from heaven like Isaiah did and destroy them? And Jesus says, you don't know what spirit you're of. I didn't come to kill people, but to deliver them. So instead of, Christians, I think, need to continue to pray for the Jews, and they need to pray for the Muslims, that they would see where the promise is and what the promise has for them. Verse 19, it continues, and God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of living water. And she went and filled a leather bag of water and gave a drink to the child. And God was with the child, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became a bowman. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, which was on that map. And his mother took to him a wife from out of Egypt. And it came to pass in that time that Abimelech, that was the one we had in the last chapter, who Abraham went to and tried to pawn off Sarah's sister, along with Ohuzath, his groomsman, and Phicol, the commander-in-chief of his force, came to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all things, whatever you should do. Good words. Now then, swear by an oath to me by God that you will not wrong me, nor my seed, nor my name, but according to the righteousness which I did with you, you shall do with me, and in the land in which you sojourned in it, and that was over in Philistia, that this Abimelech lived in. He was a king of, I forgot the city, but not Paran, was it? No. Then Abraham said, I will swear by an oath. But Abraham reproved Abimelech on account of the wells of the water, which the servants of Abimelech removed. Now, the movie Lawrence of Arabia sort of begins when Lawrence gets into Arabia and he's going out to meet the chief of the tribe, and he stops at this well with the man who's guiding him, and off in a distance you see a figure and it comes forward and he's on a camel, and he ends up shooting with a rifle the man that was a guide for Lawrence of Arabia over this well. They were dropping the bag down into the well. So a well is something of water in the desert, is apparently owned by certain tribes. And this is what happened here with Abimelech. And apparently the servants of Abraham were trying to take, the servants of Abimelech were taking the water that the servants of Abraham said that they owned this well. And Abimelech said to him, I know not who did this matter, nor you reported it to me, nor I heard, but only today. And Abraham took sheep and calves and gave to Abimelech, and both ordained a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of sheep alone. And Abimelech said to Abraham, well, what are these 7 ewe lambs of sheep, these which you set alone? And he said that you shall take of these 7 ewe lambs of mine, that they should be to me for a testimony that I dug this well, it's my well. Because of this, the name of that place is Well of the Oath, or Beersheba, for there both swore by an oath, and they ordained a covenant at the Well of the Oath, Beersheba. And Abimelech rose up, and Ohuzath his groomsman, and Phicol the commander-in-chief of his force, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted plowed fields near to Beersheba, and he called there the name of the Lord, God Almighty, Eternal, And Abraham sojourned in the land of the Philistines many days. Our next chapter, chapter 22, is a strange chapter. Abraham offers up Isaac. I hope you join us next chapter. Until then, God bless.